Last Monday, the island nation of Cuba was suddenly plunged into darkness. This is the first time in recent weeks that Cuba's entire power grid has completely collapsed, and it's also the worst so far, with the series of brownouts caused by the United States blocking incoming oil shipments without any warning, and even without any major initial problem in Cuba's power system. The entire grid simply collapsed because it couldn't handle the strain. The power did not return until almost 2 days after it went down. The nearly 10 million Cubans who rely on electricity were left without lights except for generators and candles. About 10 weeks after the United States imposed a harsh restriction on sending oil from Venezuela to Cuba, especially after the arrest of the leader Nicolas Maduro, the crisis reached a critical point. The islands are not only running out of electricity, but also basic necessities, and humanitarian aid is arriving slowly and in small amounts. Even with the strictest rationing or consumption limits, the entire country is close to losing power again in the coming weeks. Protests and social unrest are intensifying, and Cuban officials are considering unprecedented compromises with the United States. While Cubans wait in the darkness, Donald Trump told reporters on Tuesday, "I believe I will have the honor of taking Cuba. Whether I liberate it or take it, I think I can do whatever I want with it." Maduro of Venezuela is imprisoned in Brooklyn. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei of Iran is now a historical memory, and in Cuba, President Miguel Díaz-Canel seems to be the latest world leader to have found himself in Donald Trump's golden crosshairs. But before we begin, if you're new to our channel, make sure to subscribe so you'll always be updated with videos like this. Cuba in crisis, from the Bay of Pigs, which seemed like a red alert game, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, from the collapse of Soviet support to the reimposition of American embargoes in the late 2010s, the communist government of Cuba has experienced many disasters. But in more than 67 years of continuous communist rule, the country has never experienced a disaster like this. All over the world today, Cuba's situation is just part of a broader government transition and geopolitical change. The island and its people are like what Robert Penn Warren called a bubble in the stream of empire, small and seemingly easy to discard amid larger changes. The global order built by Washington after the end of the Cold War now seems to be collapsing very quickly. Alliances are becoming brittle and regimes around the world are breaking apart. Venezuela and Iran have been at the center of headlines in recent months as Washington and its allies clash with Moscow and its allies in a major geopolitical story that is attracting the attention of the whole world. But for the sake of the people in Cuba, we must not lose perspective. In any ordinary time, and have we ever really felt those, the situation in Cuba right now would be the most important story in international relations this year. So let's think more deeply first. Set aside Iran, set aside Washington, and set aside all the chaos of the year 2026 and focus your attention on Cuba. The small island nation in the Caribbean with a population of about 10 million is facing an almost complete energy blockade from the most powerful country in the world right at its doorstep. After decades of difficult but manageable coexistence and without any actual immediate threat that would prompt such an action, Washington has chosen this moment to try to bring down the regime in Cuba through pressure. The blockade became possible because of intervention of the United States and Venezuela this January, where U.S. forces removed the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, according to Washington. The removal of Maduro weakened the structure that supplies oil to Cuba because Venezuela is the main source of the island's oil supply. Under the new situation, Venezuela, with its large oil reserves, is under the de facto control of the United States. So Washington can use the flow of Venezuelan oil to exert tremendous pressure against Cuba. Havana is only able to meet about 40% of its energy needs from its own oil and natural gas production, and imports the rest, most of it from Venezuela. Because Cuba has historically not had much money, and even before the intervention there was already a great need for the help that Cuba could provide, The two countries previously agreed that Venezuela would provide fuel in exchange for the services of Cubans. But when the United States entered Caracas and imposed restrictions on oil shipments, that agreement was quickly cut off. In addition, there is a blockade that prevents other energy sources from entering Cuba, using the powerful military force and diplomatic power of Washington, leaving Havana, Cuba, almost powerless. To counter this in any meaningful way, at present, Cuba has no ability to change its situation, neither within the country nor with help from other countries that would make a significant impact. Cuba's armed forces are outdated and cannot counter not only the military presence and power that the United States displays in the region, but also the overwhelming forces stationed in mainland America. Cuba is so close to Florida that fighter jets could take off from there and drop bombs on the president's palace without even needing to refuel or use extra fuel tanks. Despite the sympathy shown by Russia, they are neither willing nor capable of forcing the United States to end the energy blockade. Although a Russian-flagged oil tanker arrived in Cuba this week in response to the crisis, there is still a high possibility that U.S. forces could intercept or stop other incoming ships before they reach the island, if they even arrive on time. China, on the other hand, has exported solar equipment to Cuba in recent years, and this has helped develop the country's renewable energy systems. But they are even less willing to intervene directly compared to what Russia is doing. In Latin America, many countries also seem unable to act freely. For example, while Mexico was seen sending over 2,000 tons of food aid to Cuba last month, leaders understand that if they further take a stronger stand against the United States, they could face severe economic sanctions, diplomatic measures, or even possible military action under the administration of Donald Trump. There are some humanitarian groups from Latin America and Europe, mostly leftist organizations, that have started organizing smaller shipments of aid. The first of these arrived on March 18, but they are small compared to the actual amount of support that Cuba needs, and they do not include the most important thing, the fuel that Havana requires. As this episode is being released, Cuba has already gone more than 3 months without any major fuel shipment. No gasoline tankers have entered because of the de facto blockade of supplies. In Washington, the goal of United States officials is clear. The communist government of Cuba, which for more than half a century was led by Fidel and Raul Castro, and now by Miguel Díaz-Canel, must fall and should not be allowed to remain in power. Donald Trump has shown his personal interest in this U.S. project regarding Cuba, where he once said that he would be honored to take Cuba, whatever happens. It is also clear from reports that Washington's strategy seems to be trying to imitate the operation in Venezuela, where, while the former regime of Nicolas Maduro remains in some aspects, it has been mixed with forces that are more aligned with the demands of the United States, and the structure of governance has changed. According to reports from American news outlets, United States negotiators have said that Miguel Díaz-Canel cannot remain in power, although it seems that the decision on how to implement this is being left to Cuba. Trump, his negotiating team, and the entire U.S. administration are strongly influenced by the Cuban-American community. Within the leadership of the United States, the most prominent member is Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The Cuban-American community, along with the large population of Cuban immigrants, has long been advocating for a regime change operation like this. Now, it's clear that they believe they've found their opportunity. If the Cuban government has any salvation at present, it's Cuba's position on Washington's list of priorities. Trump mentioned again last week, "We're talking to Cuba, but we're going to do Iran before Cuba." It's clear that this doesn't mean Cuba will simply escape Trump's attention. If you look at the events of the past few weeks, you'll see that the pressure continues. But it seems that America's main attention is focused elsewhere, which in many instances opens up a critical opportunity for Havana. In other countries with more resources, leaders use the time, take advantage of current world events for their benefit, or try to establish economic or military defenses. But in Cuba, the country has long been affected by decades of loss, destruction, and scarcity. Time is on Washington's side, not Havana's. While Havana waits for Washington to make a move, their problems only get worse. The breaking point came this week. It's no longer surprising for Cubans or observers from around the world that the situation on the island is getting worse. But on Monday, things got even worse when the entire country was suddenly plunged into darkness. An extraordinary blackout. This isn't the first time the Cuban grid has collapsed in recent weeks, but this blackout is a particularly bad sign of problems to come. It didn't just last for 29 hours, it also came without any warning. Usually there are signs in other parts of the system, localized power interruptions, or minor glitches as the grid tries to balance itself. But this time there was none. Worst of all, the blackout happened while Cuba was already under nationwide rationing. In many parts of the country, electricity was only available for about 4 hours a day, and even hospitals and other critical facilities experienced serious shortages. The collapse of the Cuban grid, even with these measures in place, is a stark reminder of the extent of the challenges facing Havana. Like most of the country's infrastructure, its power grid is outdated, and in other countries, under normal circumstances, it should have been replaced or retired a long time ago. Because of this, the public feels intense pressure, and they are expressing their feelings in ways Havana has never faced before. This is a big problem, an increase and an indication that discontent among the people is intensifying. In better times for the Cuban government, this kind of action would likely have resulted in heavy and possibly dangerous repression of the protesters, because the state has a strong and deeply entrenched secret police infrastructure ready to restore control in any potential uprising. But this time, the government's response was different. After the burning of the headquarters, the president of Cuba formally expressed sympathy for the protesters and only warned of severe punishment if the protests turned violent. On the other hand, it seemed like he supported the people's desire to express their disappointment loudly and openly. If Miguel Díaz-Canel is hoping that his softer approach to the pressure from the United States will gain sympathy from Washington, sadly, he will conclude that he was mistaken. Removing him as leader remains one of the highest priorities for American negotiators as the pressure campaign against Cuba continues. Although he did not fully accept the actions of the United States, he declared that the oil blockade was truly an economic war and promised unyielding resistance against any military invasion when asked if there were really plans to carry out such an operation. The head of the U.S. Southern Command himself stated on March 18 that there were no active plans or rehearsals for a ground invasion of Cuba. But from Havana's perspective, such reassurance has limited value. Even if the United States says they have no intention of carrying out a direct invasion, Washington has various ways to try to remove Díaz-Canel from power, not only through economic and diplomatic means, but also through other forms of military pressure. After the United States intervention in Venezuela, where Nicolas Maduro was arrested and many elite Cuban bodyguards were killed in the events, it's likely that Cuban forces know they would have a hard time stopping any similar raid by U.S. Special Operations units if it happens, because their presence in the Caribbean is already known and they are seen as one of the most powerful forces in the region. In addition, there is high activity from other U.S. forces, such as the assistance being given to Ecuador for a major offensive against organized crime and drug trafficking using U.S. naval and air assets, which shows how extensive America's military reach is in the Western Hemisphere. According to the report, the United States is also preparing for a possible mass migration from Cuba, which is expected to be led by the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Coast Guard, in case thousands of migrants try to escape at the same time due to the worsening crisis. Meanwhile, Cuban officials are trying to offer compromises to the United States, such as a more fluid commercial relationship with American companies to invest in the rehabilitation and recovery of Cuba's economy. However, these kinds of proposals would require legal changes that still need to be passed in the U.S. Congress, And this is not a simple process. Overall, in any global conflict or tensions experienced in the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, or elsewhere, the current leadership of the United States is truly more open to doing business and forging deals with different countries, even if they have different ideologies or histories, as long as it serves Washington's interests. Cuba also has important minerals such as nickel and cobalt, which are used in batteries and other industrial applications, and the opening of relations with the United States. This could create more secure supply chains for them if allowed. For example, the mining company Sherritt International has a major interest in nickel cobalt mines in Cuba, which could be given new opportunities if there are changes in the U.S. embargo policy. As part of efforts to ease tensions, the Cuban government announced the release of more than 2,000 political prisoners as a humanitarian and sovereign gesture, while they continue to face intense pressure due to oil shortages and the energy crisis. In addition, Cuba announced economic reforms in March 2026 that allow Cubans living abroad, especially in the United States and other places, to invest and own businesses on the island, open bank accounts in dollars, and access land for productive purposes. This has been called a kind of perestroika moment for the country's economy, which had already weakened due to blackouts and shortages. This move could encourage the Cuban diaspora and exiles in America to support a negotiated resolution because it opens up new economic opportunities and helps normalize relations between the two countries. As for what a so-called managed transition might look like, Cuba doesn't necessarily have to completely abandon communism to have close and vibrant economic ties with the United States, similar to what happened in Vietnam, a country that has long been under one-party communist rule and is now a close economic ally of America in the Indo-Pacific region. Meanwhile, there are discussions in the negotiations that a candidate might emerge to take over the leadership under closer ties with Washington. One of Raul Castro's grandchildren, who is said to be part of his grandfather's security detail and has connections to the country's military and economic interests, is among the potential leaders, even though this is not officially confirmed by major news outlets. This proposal is part of a focus by Washington, which announced a comprehensive overhaul of Cuba's leadership in response to the statement of Senator Marco Rubio that their economy is not working. They have problems and the leaders don't know how to fix them, so they need to have new people in leadership. However, the intention of the United States is not just regime change, but is more focused on how to establish a government that better serves American interests. This difference can cause short-term problems, especially for Cuban-American communities in South Florida who have long been calling for democratic change in Cuba and still have family and property connected to the island. Many of them believe that the Trump administration should not leave any part of the communist regime or members of the Castro family in power because of their long-standing desire to see real change in Cuba. These are communities that still have land claims in Cuba, whose interests are tied to the idea of post-communist liberation, and who still have families waiting for change. Whether this kind of broader overhaul is possible, or whether it would bring greater risks or benefits to the people of Cuba in the long run, is a separate question. And Washington's decisions on how to balance those risks will ultimately determine Cuba's future.